welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I am going to be walking you through the process of creating my first sourdough starter. So I am by no means an expert, as this is only the second time that I've tried to create a sourdough starter. The first time I attempted it, it didn't go too well. I didn't really love the instructions that I was following, and I've kind of since adapted that to a much more simplified version. I've read tons of blog posts and I've watched a ton of different videos on how to create a sourdough starter, and I've kind of taken the similarities between all of those. This is by no means 100% original. This is taking a lot of what I learned to create this kind of simplified lower waste method, because that was the thing that I really didn't like about sourdough starter, was that you had to waste a lot of the starter when you were cultivating the yeast. So real quick, for those of you who may not even know what a sourdough starter is, it's basically just a fermented flour mixture. It's just flour and water, and what you're trying to ferment is the natural yeast that's found in flour. And this is how bread was made before those little like yeast packets were invented. Like, you had to naturally cultivate the yeast in order to get your bread to rise and to bake properly. So it's a lot healthier. It's the way it's intended to be. Bread making was intended to be a very slow process, and we have since, with industrialization, kind of taken that process to a much quicker process to get bread made fast and on the shelves of the grocery store. But a lot of people have gluten intolerances because of this, and there are quite a few people who aren't celiac but who just have minor intolerances can actually eat sourdough and fermented bread, because by fermenting the flour and cultivating that yeast, it actually helps break it down before you even start baking the bread with it. So it's really interesting. I will leave some further reading that you can do on sourdough because I don't want to make this video too long. So the only things you're going to need for this process is a kitchen scale. Now, you can do this without a kitchen scale, but because sourdough starter is such a fragile thing, I highly suggest getting a kitchen scale. You can find them really inexpensive. I'll link the one that I have. Then you're going to need some kind of glass container to hold your starter. I highly recommend using glass. You can use a glass jar of some sort that you just rinse off and peel the label off. I have a video on how to do that. I will link it in the cards. It doesn't have to be fancy, just make sure it's glass. You are going to need whole wheat flour. Now, I use Bob's Red Mill organic unbleached whole wheat flour. Since I've done this twice now, the first time I just used regular kind of unbleached all-purpose flour from the start, and it didn't really work. I didn't have great success, and I found that by using the whole wheat, you have more yeast present because the yeast is present on the kernels of wheat. So by using a whole wheat or like a heartier, more nutritious wheat grain, it'll be easier for you to ferment. Then you're going to need some room temperature filtered water. A lot of people suggest using a certain degree of temperature water, but I have found that room temp usually works, especially if you're doing it in the summer. Your water will be the perfect temperature. Something to stir your starter with. I recommend like a silicone spatula, something that can really scrape down the sides of your jar so that it doesn't get dry and crusty on the sides of your jar. And then the last thing you'll need is something to cover your jar with, whether that be a plate. You can simply just put a plate on top of it. So after you've gathered everything you're going to need, we can start making the starter. So days 1 through 3 are going to be really simple. You're not going to really do much to it. To start, you're going to take your clean jar, make sure it's nice and clean. You can wipe it out with some vinegar and then kind of rinse it out to make sure it's nice and disinfected. You're going to measure out 40 grams of filtered room temperature water and pour that into your glass jar. And then you're going to measure out 40 grams of whole wheat flour and pour that into your jar. Then all you have to do is mix it very thoroughly. You want to kind of whip it a little bit to try and get some air into it. I just whip it for maybe like 1 minute just to try and get some air in it. Scrape down the sides really well and then just cover it with a plate or a cloth and leave it alone. You want to leave it out at room temperature. I just leave mine on my counter. At this point, we are not currently feeding our starter because it's really not necessary. There really is little to no activity right now in our starter, so it doesn't need to be fed yet. We kind of want to wait until that point to start feeding it. Again, this cuts down on the amount of starter that you have to waste and the amount of flour and water that you have to use. So you want to continue this same process of just leaving it alone, not feeding it, not discarding it for the first 3 to 4 days until you start to see activity. You're going to continue stirring it once in the morning, once at night. Perfect time to do it is when you're making breakfast and when you're making dinner. Now we're at day 3 or 4, depending on when your starter started to show activity, and you're going to want to discard. This is when we start the discard and feeding process. So you want to discard about almost all of it. You want to leave 1 to 2 tablespoons of starter in your jar. Now, do not throw away the part that you're discarding. I have a couple of recipes that I am testing out to use the discarded starter so that you can actually use it in something and you don't have to throw it away. And then you're going to add the same amount that we did originally, 40 grams of filtered room temperature water and 40 grams of whole wheat flour to your now new starter. So then you're going to want to stir and incorporate your flour and water into your existing starter. Stir it really well, get some air into it, make sure all the flour is incorporated, and then scrape down the sides, cover it, and then you're going to want to put a rubber band around the jar at the point where the flour and water mixture is, so that you can then look at it and see how much your starter has risen, because once your starter has risen and doubled in size, that's when you know it's ready to use to make bread. So at this point, you don't have to stir your starter twice a day anymore, and you want to repeat the same following steps until you reach about day 7 or day 8. By day 8, you definitely should have a plenty active starter. If your starter was slow to start, if your flour wasn't the greatest quality, you may have to extend that till day 10, but by day 10 you should definitely have an active enough starter, and if you don't, I would just discard it and start over, maybe use a different flour. So once you get to the point where your starter is doubling in size and it's very healthy looking, it smells kind of like yeasty. It shouldn't smell bad, but it should have sort of like a yeasty smell. It might smell a little bit sour, kind of like when you make sauerkraut type of smell. So at this point, you can continue to feed your starter every day, or you can pop it in the fridge to only feed it once a week. I prefer the once a week method just because I am not baking bread every single day. I'm not using it every single day. For the simplicity of this video and not to overwhelm you with information, I am going to have 2 other videos to go with my sourdough kind of series. One of those videos is going to be an in-depth how to maintain your starter and just kind of tips and tricks on how to maintain a starter for long term. And then the 3rd video is going to be how to use your starter in recipes, whether that be pancakes, pizza dough, bread, etc. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. But hopefully this video was in-depth enough and explained clearly enough that you can feel confident to give this a try. It is only flour and water, so it's not super expensive to make. So if you don't succeed the first time, try again. I definitely didn't succeed the first time, but that didn't stop me from wanting to try again. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up. It really helps out my channel. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you do make a sourdough starter, be sure to tag me on Instagram at @thislittle_farmhouse. I would really love to see your guys' sourdough creations and see if you guys were successful in following this method. And with that, I will see you guys in my next video.